The fastest way to discover someone's prejudice is to watch how they treat a stranger they think cannot buy anything. On a bright Saturday afternoon in Manhattan, sunlight spilled through the towering glass windows of Whitmore Luxury Timepieces, one of the most exclusive watch showrooms in New York City. Inside, polished marble floors reflected the glow of crystal lighting, and display cases held some of the rarest timepieces in the world. Collectors flew in from other states just to see what was available behind those glass showcases. Near the center of the showroom stood a display containing a limited edition watch valued at nearly $2.8 million. Customers often stopped to admire it, but very few ever asked about buying it. Angela Brooks paused in front of the display and studied the watch carefully. She wore a simple navy jacket, comfortable shoes, and carried an old brown leather handbag that looked more practical than fashionable. Nothing about her appearance demanded attention. She simply looked like a woman enjoying a quiet afternoon in the city. Across the showroom, Brandon Walker noticed her almost immediately. As manager of the store, he prided himself on being able to identify wealthy clients within seconds. Expensive suits, luxury cars, designer accessories. Those were the signs he trusted. Angela matched none of them. He watched her examine the watch for nearly a minute before walking over with a smile that never reached his eyes. "Beautiful piece, isn't it?" he asked. Angela nodded. "It certainly is. How long has it been here?" Brandon folded his arms. "Long enough." Angela continued studying the craftsmanship beneath the glass. "May I ask about the movement?" Brandon gave a short laugh. "Most people ask about the price first." Angela smiled politely. "I am more interested in the engineering." A few nearby customers glanced over. Brandon looked her up and down. "Trust me," he said. "The price is usually what matters." Angela remained calm. "And what is the price?" Brandon pointed toward the display card. $2.8 million. Angela nodded thoughtfully. "That seems reasonable considering the rarity." Several customers turned their heads. Brandon stared at her for a moment, then chuckled loudly enough for others to hear. "Reasonable," he repeated. A few shoppers exchanged awkward looks. Then Brandon said the words that immediately changed the atmosphere inside the showroom. "Tell you what, if you can afford this watch, I will quit my job." Silence spread through the room. Even the sales associate standing behind a nearby counter froze. Angela slowly turned toward him. Her expression never changed. There was no anger in her eyes, no embarrassment, no attempt to defend herself. She simply looked at him for a moment, as if evaluating something much more important than his words. Brandon seemed pleased with himself. A few customers looked uncomfortable. Others waited to see what would happen next. Angela glanced back toward the watch resting beneath the glass. The polished metal reflected the showroom lights in 100 different directions. Then she smiled softly and asked a question that caught Brandon completely off guard. "Before we discuss the price," she said, "could you tell me who assembled it?" Brandon Walker blinked once, clearly surprised by the question. For a moment, he looked back at the display card as if searching for information he should already know. "The manufacturer assembled it," he replied casually. Angela smiled politely. "Of course. I was asking which master watchmaker completed the final movement." Brandon hesitated. The answer did not come. Several nearby customers noticed. One older collector standing near another display slowly turned his head toward the conversation. Angela remained completely relaxed. She was not trying to embarrass anyone. She simply seemed genuinely interested. "I am not sure that information matters," Brandon finally said. "People buying watches at this level usually focus on ownership and status." Angela looked back through the glass. "I have always believed craftsmanship matters more." The older collector quietly nodded to himself. Brandon forced a smile and checked his watch. "Well, most people are not spending millions because of craftsmanship." Angela did not argue. Instead, she continued admiring the details of the watch. The polished case reflected tiny beams of light across the showroom. The intricate movement seemed almost alive beneath the crystal. As the conversation faded, a nervous young sales associate accidentally dropped a stack of presentation folders near the front desk. Papers scattered across the marble floor. Several customers stepped around them without stopping. The young employee immediately crouched down, clearly embarrassed. Before anyone else moved, Angela walked over and helped gather the papers. "Take your time," she said warmly. "Nobody is judging you." The young associate smiled gratefully. "Thank you, ma'am." Within seconds, Everything was organized again. Angela handed him the final folder and returned to the display case. Brandon watched the interaction but said nothing. To him, she still appeared to be someone passing time inside a store far beyond her means. What he failed to notice was how naturally people responded to her kindness. The nervous employee looked more relaxed. The older collector continued observing her with curiosity. Even a woman browsing another showcase offered Angela a small appreciative smile. There was something about her calm presence that drew respect without demanding it. Angela returned her attention to the watch. "May I ask another question?" she said. Brandon sighed internally. "Sure." How many examples were produced? This answer he knew. Only 12 worldwide. Angela nodded thoughtfully. That explains the valuation. Brandon folded his arms. Most people who ask that many questions are not serious buyers. The words hung in the air. Angela looked at him. Do serious buyers stop being curious? The question caught him off guard. He had no immediate response. Across the showroom, the older collector smiled again. Angela never raised her voice. She never challenged Brandon directly. Yet every answer she gave seemed thoughtful and measured. The conversation continued for several minutes. Angela asked about production history, ownership records, servicing procedures, and movement specifications. Her questions became increasingly detailed. Brandon answered what he could and avoided what he could not. Slowly, a strange feeling began forming in the showroom. The people listening were starting to realize something Brandon had not yet noticed. Angela understood the watch exceptionally well. Not as someone pretending to belong, not as someone browsing out of curiosity, but as someone completely comfortable discussing an object worth millions of dollars. Still, Brandon remained convinced of his original judgment. He looked at her simple jacket, her worn leather handbag, her modest appearance, and he trusted those assumptions more than the evidence standing directly in front of him. Brandon Walker had built his entire career on a belief he never questioned. He believed success had a certain look. Wealth had a certain look. Influence had a certain look. After nearly 15 years managing luxury showrooms in Manhattan, he considered himself an expert at identifying important customers within seconds of seeing them. He noticed watches before he noticed faces, shoes before conversations, designer labels before personalities. Most of the time, those assumptions appeared to work. Wealthy clients often arrived in expensive vehicles, wore recognizable brands, and carried themselves with visible confidence. Over the years, Brandon had stopped seeing people as individuals and started seeing them as categories. Serious buyers, casual browsers, potential clients, people wasting time. In his mind, Angela Brooks belonged firmly in the last category. As she continued examining the watch, Brandon glanced toward a couple entering the showroom through the front doors. Immediately, his attention shifted. The man wore a tailored Italian suit. The woman carried a designer handbag recognized by nearly everyone familiar with luxury fashion. Brandon smiled and walked toward them. "Welcome to Whitmore Luxury Timepieces," he said warmly. "Please let me know how I can assist you today." Angela noticed the difference instantly. The enthusiasm, the attention, the respect. Yet she showed no reaction. She simply continued studying the display case. Several customers had noticed the contrast as well. The older collector who had been quietly observing the interaction raised an eyebrow, but remained silent. Across the room, the young sales associate Angela had helped earlier watched with growing discomfort. Brandon spent several minutes speaking with the newly arrived couple before returning. "Still looking?" he asked Angela. "Still learning," she replied. Brandon forced a polite smile. Most people spending this kind of money already know what they want. Angela nodded thoughtfully. Sometimes the people who know the most ask the most questions. Brandon chuckled. "That has not been my experience." Angela rested one hand lightly against the glass display. Experience can teach valuable lessons. Her eyes moved toward the watch. It can also reinforce incorrect assumptions. The words were gentle, but something about them made Brandon uncomfortable. He quickly dismissed the feeling. Around him, the showroom remained busy. Soft music played through hidden speakers. Light reflected across polished marble floors. Employees moved between display cases helping customers. Everything looked exactly as it always did. Yet beneath the surface, subtle shifts were beginning to occur. More people were listening when Angela spoke. More people were paying attention. Not because she demanded attention, but because every question she asked revealed knowledge, patience, and confidence. Brandon noticed it too, though he interpreted it differently. To him, Angela's knowledge felt suspicious, almost rehearsed. He convinced himself she had researched expensive watches online. Maybe she enjoyed pretending to belong in luxury spaces. The explanation comforted him because it allowed him to preserve his original judgment. Admitting he might be wrong felt far more difficult. Angela reached into her old leather handbag and removed a small notebook. She wrote down several details about the watch before closing it again. Brandon watched carefully. The worn edges of the notebook seemed to confirm everything he already believed. What he failed to notice was that truly successful people often stopped caring about appearances long before everyone else did. Standing beneath the bright showroom lights, surrounded by millions of dollars in luxury inventory, Brandon remained completely confident in his ability to judge people. And that confidence was about to become the most expensive mistake of his life. The afternoon crowd inside Whitmore luxury timepieces continued to grow. Sunlight filtered through the towering glass windows and danced across rows of polished display cases filled with rare watches worth more than most homes. Angela Brooks remained near the limited edition timepiece, quietly studying its details while the showroom moved around her. She seemed completely unaffected by the tension that had gradually formed during the past hour. Brandon Walker, however, found himself becoming increasingly irritated. Every question Angela asked revealed knowledge he had not expected. Every answer she gave challenged assumptions he preferred not to examine. Yet instead of reconsidering his judgment, he became more determined to defend it. Near the front entrance, a wealthy-looking customer began expressing frustration over a special order that had not arrived on schedule. A young sales associate attempted to explain the delay, but the conversation quickly became uncomfortable. The employee looked overwhelmed. Several customers turned to watch. Before the situation could escalate further, Angela quietly stepped forward. "Excuse me," she said gently. Both individuals looked at her. "May I offer a suggestion?" The customer hesitated but nodded. Angela listened carefully to the concern before calmly explaining how luxury manufacturers often delayed limited production deliveries to ensure quality standards were maintained. She spoke with remarkable familiarity about the process. Within minutes, the frustrated customer's expression softened. The conversation became productive. The young associate looked visibly relieved. "Thank you," he said after the customer walked away. Angela smiled. "You handled it better than you think." The employee's confidence immediately returned. Several people nearby noticed the interaction. One customer even approached Angela afterward and thanked her for helping. Brandon noticed as well. Instead of appreciating what had happened, he felt annoyed that she had inserted herself into a situation inside his showroom. "You seem very comfortable giving advice," he said as he approached. Angela looked at him calmly. "Sometimes people simply need someone willing to listen." Brandon folded his arms. "Most customers focus on shopping." Angela smiled. "Most successful businesses focus on people." The response drew another subtle reaction from those nearby. The older collector who had been observing throughout the afternoon appeared increasingly intrigued. Brandon, meanwhile, felt as though control of the room was slipping away from him. He glanced toward Angela's worn leather handbag again and used it to reinforce his assumptions. He convinced himself that her confidence was nothing more than an act. That explanation felt easier than admitting he might have misjudged her. Angela returned to the display case and examined the watch once more. "Has the manufacturer released any updated ownership history on this piece?" she asked. Brandon shook his head. "Why would that matter?" Angela looked through the glass. "Because provenance often determines long-term value more than rarity." The older collector smiled openly this time. He knew she was correct. Brandon did not notice. Or perhaps he chose not to. The showroom lights reflected across the crystal surface of the watch as Angela continued asking thoughtful questions. Around her, more customers listened than before. More employees paid attention. Without trying to impress anyone, she was slowly earning the respect of everyone in the room. Everyone except the one person who needed the lesson most. By late afternoon, the atmosphere inside Whitmore luxury timepieces felt noticeably different from when Angela Brooks had first entered the showroom. Customers still browsed the displays. Employees still moved between showcases. Soft music still drifted through the elegant space. Yet beneath the polished surface, a quiet tension had taken hold. More people were watching Angela now. Not because she demanded attention, but because she seemed completely unaffected by the assumptions surrounding her. The limited edition watch remained under the glass case, illuminated by carefully positioned lights that made every detail sparkle. Angela stood before it once again, studying the craftsmanship with the same patience she had shown all day. Brandon Walker approached with growing frustration hidden beneath professional courtesy. He had expected her to leave hours ago. Instead, she remained calm, knowledgeable, and increasingly respected by those around her. "Still considering it?" he asked. Angela smiled lightly. "I believe important decisions deserve time." Brandon folded his arms. Most people who can afford something like this do not spend an entire afternoon thinking about it. Several nearby customers immediately noticed the comment. Angela looked toward the watch. "That depends on how they earned their money." The response drew a subtle reaction from the older collector, who appeared more impressed with every passing minute. Brandon forced a smile. "I suppose that is one way to look at it." Angela did not respond. Instead, she opened her small notebook and reviewed a few handwritten notes. Brandon watched carefully. The worn pages only strengthened the story he had created in his own mind. To him, appearances still mattered more than evidence. Across the showroom, the young sales associate approached Angela. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said politely. "I wanted to thank you again for helping earlier." Angela smiled warmly. "You handled the situation yourself. I simply reminded you that you could." The employee laughed softly. "I wish more customers were like you." Brandon overheard every word. The growing admiration people felt toward Angela made him increasingly uncomfortable. It challenged his belief that he understood exactly who belonged inside spaces like this. Wanting to regain control of the situation, he gestured toward the display case. "Well, if you are serious about purchasing it, I can begin the paperwork." The words sounded polite, but the tone carried unmistakable skepticism. Angela met his eyes. "Do you usually begin paperwork before answering all of a customer's questions?" Brandon hesitated. Several customers nearby quietly listened. Most customers are interested in ownership. Angela glanced toward the watch again. "I am interested in stewardship." The answer confused him. Angela continued. "Objects like this survive longer than the people who buy them. Understanding their history matters." For a brief moment, nobody spoke. The showroom lights reflected across the crystal display. The city beyond the glass windows slowly shifted toward evening. Angela reached into her old leather handbag and removed her phone. She looked at the screen, read a message, and smiled faintly. Then she typed a short response and slipped the phone away. Brandon noticed. "Good news?" he asked with a hint of sarcasm. Angela looked toward the entrance of the showroom. "Perhaps." Her calm answer seemed ordinary. Yet something about it made Brandon uneasy. For the first time all afternoon, he felt the faintest sense that events were moving beyond his control. And just beyond the glass entrance doors, someone important was about to arrive. The late afternoon sunlight had begun turning golden when the atmosphere inside Whitmore luxury timepieces shifted once again. Long reflections stretched across the marble floors, and the city beyond the towering glass windows glowed beneath the fading light. Customers continued browsing quietly, but many remained aware of the unusual tension surrounding Angela Brooks and Brandon Walker. Angela stood calmly near the display case containing the rare watch, her hands resting lightly on her old leather handbag. She appeared completely at peace. Brandon, meanwhile, felt increasingly restless. He could not explain why. Every instinct told him she did not belong among the clientele who typically purchased items worth millions of dollars. Yet every conversation he had with her seemed to challenge that belief. The showroom doors opened. A soft chime echoed through the elegant space. Several employees looked toward the entrance automatically. A distinguished older gentleman stepped inside wearing a tailored suit and carrying himself with quiet confidence. The moment Brandon saw him, his posture changed. "Mr. Whitmore," he said immediately. "Good afternoon." Charles Whitmore, founder and owner of the luxury watch company, was not expected at the showroom that day. Employees rarely saw him in person. Customers often recognized him from business, magazines, and industry events. Brandon quickly walked toward him with a welcoming smile. "We are honored to have you here." Charles returned the greeting politely, but his attention seemed focused elsewhere. His eyes moved across the showroom, searching for someone. Brandon noticed. "Is there anything I can help you with?" Charles did not answer immediately. Then his expression brightened. "There she is." Before Brandon could respond, Charles began walking across the showroom. Several employees watched curiously. Customers turned their heads. Brandon followed behind, confused. Charles continued directly toward Angela Brooks. When he reached her, a warm smile spread across his face. "Angela," he said, "I was hoping I would catch you before you left." The entire showroom seemed to freeze. Angela smiled back. "Good to see you, Charles." The familiarity between them immediately drew attention. Brandon stopped walking. The older collector raised his eyebrows. The young sales associate stared in disbelief. Charles gestured toward the watch display. "Have they been taking good care of you?" Angela glanced briefly toward Brandon before looking back at Charles. "I have had a very educational afternoon." Something about the answer caused Charles to study her more carefully. He noticed the subtle amusement in her expression. Then he looked around the showroom. Employees appeared nervous. Customers seemed unusually attentive. Brandon suddenly felt a knot forming in his stomach. Charles lowered his voice slightly. "Everything all right?" Angela nodded. "Perfectly fine." The answer was calm, but it did not ease Brandon's growing concern. Charles smiled and placed one hand lightly against the display case. "I am glad. We always appreciate visits from our most valued friends." The words seemed simple, yet several people immediately sensed their significance. Brandon certainly did. He looked from Charles to Angela and back again. Questions flooded his mind. How did they know each other? Why did the owner seem genuinely pleased to see her? Why was he treating her as an equal? Outside the windows, the sun dipped lower across the Manhattan skyline. Inside the showroom, silence slowly settled over the room. And for the first time all day, Brandon Walker began wondering whether the woman he had judged from the moment she entered might not be who he thought she was at all. The silence inside Whitmore luxury timepieces grew heavier with every passing second. Employees stood motionless. Customers pretended to continue browsing, but nearly every eye remained fixed on Angela Brooks and Charles Whitmore. The golden evening light pouring through the showroom windows seemed to slow time itself. Brandon Walker felt a growing unease he could not explain. He had spent the entire afternoon convinced he understood exactly who Angela was. Yet the scene unfolding before him no longer fit that belief. Charles smiled warmly. "I heard from my office that you were visiting Manhattan, but I did not realize you planned to stop by today." Angela lightly touched the glass display case. "I had some free time and wanted to see the new collection in person." Charles nodded. "I am glad you did." His eyes moved toward the limited edition watch. "Have you made a decision?" Angela smiled. "I am still considering it." Charles laughed softly. "That sounds like you. Always studying every detail before making a choice." Several customers exchanged curious glances. The older collector folded his arms and listened carefully. Brandon stood only a few feet away now. Every word seemed to deepen his confusion. Charles looked around the showroom. "You know, most people only see the finished product." He gestured toward the watch. "Very few appreciate the craftsmanship the way Angela does." Angela shook her head modestly. "I simply enjoy learning." Charles smiled. "That attitude is one reason you have been so successful." The sentence immediately captured everyone's attention. Brandon felt his stomach tighten. Charles continued speaking naturally, completely unaware of the tension surrounding the room. "I still remember the investment conference in Geneva 10 years ago. Most people in the room were chasing trends. You were studying long-term value." Angela laughed quietly. "And everyone thought I was being too cautious." Everyone except the people who became billionaires. Afterward, Charles replied. The showroom became completely silent. Brandon blinked. He was certain he had heard the word correctly. Billionaires. Several customers looked at one another. The young sales associate's eyes widened. Charles seemed surprised by the sudden quiet. Then he noticed the expressions around him. "Wait," he said. "Do people here not know who Angela is?" Nobody answered. Brandon felt his face grow warm. Charles looked genuinely confused. "Angela Brooks is one of the most respected investors in the country." The words landed like a thunderclap. Her companies manage assets across multiple industries. He smiled toward Angela. "She has probably forgotten more about value creation than most executives ever learn." No one spoke. Brandon could barely breathe. The old leather handbag, the simple jacket, the calm questions, the quiet confidence. Every assumption he had made throughout the day suddenly collapsed. Charles glanced toward the watch again. Honestly, Angela could buy every watch in this showroom if she wanted to. A nervous laugh escaped from one customer. Brandon did not move. His own words echoed in his mind with painful clarity. If you can afford this watch, I will quit my job. Angela remained completely composed. She showed no satisfaction, no arrogance, no desire to embarrass anyone. She simply stood beneath the golden evening light exactly as she had all afternoon. Yet now everyone saw her differently. Everyone except Angela herself, because she had never needed their recognition to understand her own worth. The silence that followed seemed to stretch across the entire showroom. The golden evening light reflected through the crystal display cases, casting long patterns across the marble floor. Customers stood frozen. Employees avoided eye contact. Even the soft music playing through the showroom seemed distant now. Brandon Walker felt as though the room had suddenly become much smaller. Every confident assumption he had made throughout the day now stood exposed before everyone. Charles Whitmore looked around and slowly began to understand what had happened. His expression shifted. "Angela," he said gently, "has everything been all right during your visit?" Angela met his eyes and offered a calm smile. "I have had an interesting afternoon." The answer was polite. Too polite. Charles knew her well enough to recognize that she was choosing her words carefully. He glanced toward Brandon. The manager immediately looked down. Charles did not need further explanation. Angela reached into her old leather handbag and removed a folded piece of paper. It was not a bank statement, not a contract, not proof of wealth. It was simply a page filled with handwritten notes. She looked down at it for a moment before folding it closed again. Charles noticed. "Research?" he asked. Angela nodded. "Observations." Several customers listened quietly. Brandon wished he could disappear. Angela looked toward the display case containing the watch. "I came here because I admire craftsmanship." Her voice remained calm. "The watch is extraordinary." Then her eyes moved toward the employees working throughout the showroom. "Some of the people here are extraordinary too." The young sales associate immediately lowered his head, humbled by the compliment. Angela continued. "They were patient, professional, helpful." Brandon felt every word. She had praised everyone except him. Yet she had not criticized him either. Somehow that felt worse. Charles crossed his arms. "And the rest of your observations?" Angela paused briefly. "I learned something interesting today." The room became silent again. People often believe they are evaluating others. Her eyes moved gently across the showroom, when in reality, they are revealing themselves. No one spoke. The words settled over the room with undeniable weight. Brandon finally stepped forward. His confidence was gone. "Ms. Brooks," he said quietly. Angela looked at him. "I owe you an apology." The admission surprised everyone. Brandon swallowed hard. "I made assumptions about you from the moment you walked through the door." His voice sounded smaller than it ever had before. "I judged your appearance, your clothes, your handbag." Several employees lowered their eyes. They remembered every moment. "I treated you differently because of what I assumed you could afford." Angela, listen patiently. Brandon continued. "I was wrong." For several seconds, neither person spoke. The city lights outside the showroom slowly began replacing the fading sunlight. Finally, Angela smiled softly. Not triumphantly, not smugly, simply kindly. The watch was never the real test. Brandon looked confused. Angela continued. "Character always is." Charles nodded slowly. The older collector smiled to himself. The young sales associate looked inspired. Brandon felt the truth of those words immediately. Throughout the entire afternoon, Angela had been measuring something far more valuable than a luxury timepiece. She had been observing how people treated someone they believed had no power. And the result of that test was standing plainly before everyone to see. For a long moment, nobody inside Whitmore Luxury Timepieces spoke. The showroom that had felt busy and vibrant only hours earlier now seemed filled with reflection. Evening settled over Manhattan beyond the towering glass windows. The city lights gradually illuminated the streets below, while the final traces of sunlight faded from the skyline. Angela Brooks stood beside the display case containing the rare watch she had spent the afternoon studying. The polished crystal reflected the soft glow of the showroom lights, creating a quiet sense of calm after an unforgettable day. Charles Whitmore looked around the room and smiled faintly. "The remarkable thing about Angela," he said, "is that she never needs people to know who she is." Several employees nodded. They understood exactly what he meant now. Angela glanced toward the young sales associate she had helped earlier. The employee smiled back with genuine appreciation. The older collector offered a respectful nod before returning to his own shopping. One by one, people began returning to their conversations. Yet something had changed. Not because they had learned Angela was a billionaire, because they had witnessed the difference between status and character. Charles turned toward the display case. "So," he asked with a grin, "have you finally decided?" Angela looked once more at the extraordinary timepiece. She admired the craftsmanship, the history, the precision. Then she smiled. "Yes." Brandon held his breath. Angela's expression remained thoughtful. "It is beautiful." Charles laughed softly. "That sounds like a purchase." Angela shook her head. "Actually, I think I will pass." The answer surprised everyone. Charles raised an eyebrow. "Really?" Angela nodded. "I learned something more valuable today." No one questioned what she meant. Brandon certainly understood. The watch remained exactly where it had been all afternoon. Yet somehow it no longer seemed like the most important object in the room. Angela picked up her old leather handbag and prepared to leave. Before reaching the entrance, she paused beside Brandon. He looked genuinely humbled. "Ms. Brooks," he said quietly, "thank you for giving me more grace than I deserve." Angela smiled warmly. People grow when they are willing to learn. Brandon nodded. He would remember those words for the rest of his life. Angela then walked toward the glass doors. The young sales associate opened them for her. "Have a wonderful evening," he said. "You too," Angela replied. Outside, the city shimmered beneath thousands of lights. Angela stepped onto the sidewalk and disappeared into the rhythm of Manhattan, just another person moving through the evening crowd. Inside the showroom, Brandon remained standing beside the display case. The watch reflected the lights above, but his attention was fixed on the door through which Angela had exited. Earlier that day, he believed wealth could be identified by appearances. Now he understood how wrong that belief had been. Some of the most valuable people in the world carried their success quietly. As the evening continued and customers resumed browsing, the showroom felt strangely different. Not because a billionaire had visited, because a lesson had. And long after Angela Brooks disappeared into the city, that lesson remained, reflected softly in the glass where a rare watch still waited for its next owner.